Welcome to the Highly Sensitive Money Podcast. I am Deanna, your host, and I'm so glad you're joining us for this episode. Today, we're diving into a powerful conversation with Rahkim Sabree, a financial coach, author, and thought leader whose work focuses on financial education, trauma, and the emotional connections that shape our money habits. Growing up in Mount Vernon, New York, Rahkim experienced financial hardship firsthand, and he now uses those insights to address the complex layers of financial empowerment and healing in marginalized communities. In this episode, Rahkim shares how generational trauma, systemic barriers, and financial literacy intersect. He believes that true financial empowerment is about more than budgeting and saving. It's about healing from past experiences and unlearning limiting beliefs that often hold us back. Please note that neither Rahkim nor I are therapists, so take our thoughts on trauma as the result of our own personal work and research. Rahkim is passionate about moving beyond simple financial advice and diving into the emotions, memories, and traumas that shape how we interact with money. His insights will resonate with anyone who has felt a disconnect between their financial goals and their current reality. And his approach brings a compassionate lens to topics often viewed through a hard, logical framework. So, whether you're here to learn, reflect, or maybe heal a little along the way, this episode offers something truly special. Welcome, Rahkim. I'm so excited to have you on Highly Sensitive Money and to talk about money and social justice and your story as a financial expert.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
So we almost met in person at
Yep,
FinCon New Orleans 2023.
yep.
That didn't fully happen, but we did get to have a conversation, I think earlier this year, really to learn about each other's story.
Yes, definitely. I caught COVID in New Orleans. So I had to cut out early, but I love the work that you're doing, and it's so aligned to the work that I'm doing. So, again, I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah. And Rakim, can you give like a little bit brief overview of like where you started, where you are now for people that may be new to your
Yeah,
work?
so I started in the banking industry as a part time teller back in 2011. I was 21 years old. I did not know anything about financial products, financial services, financial strategies. And today I identify as a financial therapist and accredited financial counselor through the AFCPE. So a lot of my work centers around more than just the educational aspects of how do you budget, how do you save, how do you build credit, but more of the behavior, the emotions. And I center a lot of the work that I do in financial therapy around financial trauma.
And what was it that had you shift from straight financial literacy? Or like, did you start with straight financial literacy? Like, how did you slowly start to evolve into bringing in trauma and therapeutic
Yeah,
approaches?
great question. It happened really organically. So, based off of my own experiences or lack of experience, rather, with money and some of the more painful money memories that I had from my growing up, I started to talk about financial empowerment as a distinguishing kind of niche from general financial education. What I recognized early on is that people who are experiencing poverty may be financially educated, but may not be in a position to execute on the things that they know they should be doing. And so I think, we'll uncover more of that in this conversation when we talk about some of the systemic barriers to what financial success looks like. What does generational trauma look like, and how does that impact our decision making today? But as I use this term financial empowerment, I started to create content around that. Ultimately, ended up writing a book, Financially Irresponsible, where at the same time I was reading a book called Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroy. And so Dr. DeGroy talks about how there is a PTSD like effect of slavery on Black Americans who have been here, generationally, that impact the way that we show up, the way that we view ourselves, our behavior, really every facet of our experiences. And I thought that that's be so profound as I was writing Financially Irresponsible. So I said, oh, generational trauma, I'm going to call this financial trauma. And so I inadvertently thought that I created the term financial trauma. As I continued to use this term and people seemed to react well to it, I started encountering other people who were using the term financial trauma. And ultimately, I encountered financial psychologists and financial therapists through the Financial Therapy Association. What I recognized at that point was that much of the conversation being had around financial trauma existed in the realms of academia. And so it wasn't a very public conversation that we were having in tandem with the efforts around financial literacy. And so, if I'm going to be very transparent, I kind of felt offended when I would go into spaces and hear about unbanked and underbanked communities and how we need to go out into these communities and push financial literacy as the solution to their problem, when really it was access to resources, access to capital, access to healing from so much of the generational trauma that a lot of the behaviors that we see surface today are a reaction to. And so I doubled down in my work and on the term financial trauma while increasing my knowledge on what was already done as far as research, as far as intervention methods, as far as the different credentials that exist to help people navigate the mental side of this equation. And so that's when I started to pursue the financial counseling designation through the AFCPE. I am a trauma of money certified practitioner through the trauma of money program. And I am a certified financial therapist candidate through the Financial Therapy Association. So really looking at financial trauma through multiple lenses and multiple approaches to what that healing looks like, while also being very cognizant of cultural influences on how trauma manifests in different groups.
Yeah, wow, that's a really I love the story of just like you starting out with one very specific tool, right? Financial literacy, and then really looking at the systems that people move in and all of us reasons that are underneath, that are underground, that may make it so that people don't actually implement what they say they're going to
Right,
implement, right? Because it's like, I love to compare food and money because you know what you're supposed to eat, you know what you're supposed to put on your plate, you know how many times you're supposed to work out, but then why
right.
don't you do it, right? And it's saying that it's willpower, saying that it's like not the person's not able to, doesn't take into account what if there's food deserts? What if there's not enough childcare? What if they're eating for emotional reasons? Like there's so many reasons that we do what we do with money outside of the
Yes.
math.
I think that that's an important point to make, right? As we look at some of these equations from a holistic perspective, everything's connected. You compare food to money, but money and food is connected, right? How do we get food? We need to have money. And then, so you talk about food deserts. You talk about, further going into this, right? I recently came across information that some of the fast food, which is more easy to purchase based off of purchasing price, have been engineered to make you addicted to it, right? It's been engineered to make you want more of it. So not only are we in a situation where, from an economic perspective, it's easier to buy crap food, but from the way that our body reacts to it, dopamine or whatever the chemical reactions that are taking place, we're now craving this food. And those food and the types of food that we eat are ultimately going to have an impact on our health, what kind of diseases that we experience or encounter, how that shows up in future generations, right? So a lot of conversation I've been having around financial trauma centers the studies of epigenetics and how what shows up in previous generations can ultimately impact the way genes are expressed in future generations. And so you have epigenetic studies that speak to food and genes are expressed off of what the dietary habits of maybe our grandparents or our parents were. And so when we look at everything through these different lenses as siloed activities, and it's like, okay, well, we're trying to deconstruct or figure out, well, what is the solution? But when we zoom out and we look at it from a holistic perspective, everything is connected, everything impacts everything else.
Yeah, definitely. I got more involved with trauma work actually through like my personal life rather than specifically with money. When the pandemic happened and we were all like sent home, I started attending a women's meditation group based out of DC. I mean, it was online, so it didn't matter where I was. And that was really where I first started to hear about trauma. And the definition that I heard there, I'm curious to hear your take on this definition. But what I remember from my teacher, Rashmi Ripley, she said that trauma happens when, as a young child, there's something that happens that's overwhelming that's like too big that you don't have the skills to process it. And she was talking about developmental trauma, so childhood trauma. So what the child will do is they'll kind of shove it down, right? They'll just repress it, they'll put it down. And then as your life becomes more stable, as you become more secure, then that trauma that you weren't able to process before starts to come up, which feels like such a cruel, cruel joke. You know, here you are working on yourself, trying to get things steady, and then all of this stuff that like happened when you were a child. And talking about epigenetics, right? That happened to your parents, that happened to your grandparents. All of that stuff starts to
Yep.
come up. Right. So that's my explanation, like how I understand trauma. I'd love to hear from like all of the training that you've taken, all of the work that you've done. Like, how do you explain trauma to people? And then how do you explain it specifically to
Yeah.
finances?
Let me answer that question in the reverse. So, financial trauma has a couple of definitions in flight. There is a clinical definition that's kind of more aligned to what you're talking about that speaks to prolonged financial stress, the experience of prolonged financial stress manifesting as financial trauma. I define financial trauma through more of a cultural, we'll use the word cultural lens, right? And that is financial trauma is any instance observed or experienced that has a negative impact on the way that you view, interact with, or believe about money. So the difference in the way that these two definitions are expressed is that really clinicians are viewing trauma, financial trauma, through a lens of a first-hand experience. And so, as we talk about epigenetics and we talk about generational trauma, just what we observe in childhood, there is the internalization of that trauma that may not have been our firsthand experience, but an observation. And so, my definition of financial trauma speaks to or space for that trauma to occur, even if you are experiencing it as a third party. Specifically to the directives or the guidance or the misguidance that we may experience as a child when it comes to money. I think of an experience that I had when I was getting ready to go away for college. So I was 18 years old. A neighbor who watched me grow up in the apartment that I lived in, where we experienced the food stamps, the Section 8, all those things, right? Saw me packing up and getting ready to be shipped off. And she's like, whatever you do when you go out to college, don't take out any credit cards. And I'm like, okay, yeah, like, okay, neighbor. She's like, no, I'm serious. Like, don't take out any credit cards. Credit cards will ruin you. Like, they're going to offer you all types of credit cards when you get on that campus. Do not take out any credit cards. And do I feel like that was poor advice? No, I feel like it was incomplete advice. I feel like she communicated with me in the way that she felt was going to be the most effective in this kind of like passing interaction. But it was also a fear based explanation, right? Don't do it because it's the boogeyman, right? And I think at 18, we have this inclination to be rebellious against some of the advice from older folks, right? So
So you did the opposite and took out all
actually,
the credit cards?
I
Like, what
did it.
happened?
But I think that certainly there was space in my mind that says, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. I'm going to prove her wrong. Fortunately slash unfortunately, or actually unfortunately slash fortunately for me, when I did go to apply for credit cards at that age, I was declined, right? Like I used to shop at Express. I would go into Express. I would go into Macy's. I would go into Sears. Of course, every single time you go to the register, the cashier is like, hey, do you want to save 20% by signing up for this credit card? And I thought, and I was told, that the easiest way to establish credit at that age was with a store card. So I'm like, yeah, sign me up. And every time I would apply and get the negative ding, I didn't realize that it was impacting my credit profile because I didn't have that education, right? So a completion to her sentence could have been, don't apply for credit cards if you don't have the means to pay for it, if, whatever, right? Explaining to me the reason why behind this advice is more effective or would have likely been more effective than just trying to expose me to the boogeyman, right? And so that's why I talk about financial trauma in that way. I think about how some of those experiences that we observe or that we hear from firsthand accounts of, oh, I invested in the stock market and I lost all my money, so I don't trust it, right? Then impact what our future decision making looks like when it comes to money management. Speaking of trauma very generally, and I'm not a mental health professional, so this is a little bit outside of my realm, but based off of the trainings that I've undergone, I think, from a developmental perspective, what you're describing is very accurate, right? I've been exposed to intervention method that speaks to internal family systems that talk about the firefighter parts and the manager parts, right? And so when we look at it from a systems perspective or internal systems perspective, the case that IFS makes is that we are not having this uniform reaction to these different experiences. There are parts of us internally that may develop more in response to certain triggers, stimuli, trauma, and there are parts of us that will be underdeveloped because we're trying to protect those parts of us, those vulnerable parts of us. And so you may have heard in popular culture the inner child, right, being described as, this, almost sentient being that exists within you, and it's all encompassing. Well, IFS makes a case that says, and I may be butchering it, but makes a case that says there is a part of you that may be underdeveloped and may be reacting as a child would to this particular stimuli, but it's not applied to everything else. And so, how do you create space to allow that part of you to get more exposure, to fully develop, to heal, while telling the other parts of you that are looking to save the parts of you that weren't developed, hey, back off, create, like, let there be space for this part to fully develop. And so, systems theory talks about parts of the whole, right? The individual parts can exist on their own, but they exist as a part of a greater ecosystem that contributes to the whole. I think a great analogy is how our organs work, right? Our heart has a job, and it does that job by itself. But the heart also plays a role in the greater part of our functioning, right? How we show up, our heart and our lungs are tied together. Our heart and our liver is tied together. But each one of those systems operate within their own jurisdiction. And so when we talk about when we experience trauma in that developmental timeline, when we talk about how we react to that trauma in that developmental timeline, and ultimately what we do to nurture the parts of us that were the most impacted by that trauma in that developmental timeline, all of those things matter. And so we're healing different pieces of us at a time. It's not this uniform or blanket approach that financial literacy tries to solve for and saying, you just need more education. You just need to stick to the plan. You need somebody to hold your hand through, or you're a bad person because you can't do it. We have to kind of like assess each part that contributes to where this disconnect is in line with what ultimately your values and your goals look like.
Right, right, right. Like what we mentioned at the beginning, right? It's like financial literacy is saying like head knowledge is enough. But in reality, there's so many things happening underground. And let's see if I fully follow what you were saying about part system. And I'm somewhat familiar with IRFS. That's, I believe, by Robert Schwartz or Richard Schwartz. And I think was one of the things that he talks about, like the inner child, what he would call it is like the inner exile, the part of us that we reject. Right. And I'm thinking sometimes when I work with clients, I'll ask them about what they've been like with money throughout their entire life, right? So if my client's in their 50s, then they may have had like a version of them when they were children, a version of them as young adults, a version of them married, a version of them divorced. And in each of these different permutations of our life, how we relate to money may be different. And like something that I sometimes do with them is I invite them to like name those versions, right? And see how, as they're trying to integrate them, right? Because like what you said, what I understood that you said is it's not so much about healing one of them, but integrating them, having them all come together as part of a whole. What I'll invite them to do is see like, okay, think of all the different versions you've been before. What were their pros and cons? What have they all taught you? who do you want to be with money going forward,
Yeah.
right?
And I think just adding on to that, when sometimes we operate through a lens of who we would like to be or who we previously were, and we have a hard time letting that version of ourselves go, or we carry shame for not being able. Here's a good analogy: think of a professional athlete, right, who can no longer perform at the level that they may have previously performed. Mentally, they know that they've done it, that they could have done it at one point in time, but their body may not be able to support what it is that they were previously able to do. And so, what kind of discord does that create internally around, I used to be able to do this thing, but I can't do this thing anymore? And how do you tie your identity into what it is that you used to be able to do that you can no longer do anymore, right? You might suffer from a decrease in self esteem based off of how you've built your identity around this function that you used to be able to perform. And I think that people struggle with the aging process when it comes to just what they have the ability to do or what they no longer have the ability to do physically or even mentally, right? The bandwidth that we might have when it comes to certain things like concentration, memory, etc., right? And so I thinking about that through the lens of money and through the different points of our development, I think that's important too. Where we have those conversations, we need to remove the shame or the guilt from I can no longer do this, or this is not who I am, or this is not who I want to be, and help people, like you said, make peace with that version, their current version of reality, before they start crafting a different version of reality. Because a lot of times I think we can live with our head in the clouds, right? I want to be this person, or I want to have attained this. And because I haven't gotten there yet, and I'm speaking from my personal experience, because I haven't gotten there yet, I'm frustrated. I'm clear on where I want to go, but I'm frustrated with my current reality. How do we create a bridge between where we are and where we would like to be? Sometimes that's education based. Sometimes that is based off of support and just kind of removing blockages in the way that we think about or approach things. Sometimes that is injecting some realism into the goals that we might have. Sometimes that's eliminating or breaking some of the limiting beliefs that we might have when it comes to some of the goals that or the decision making that we're experiencing in this current moment. I think therapists do a really good job at helping arrive at these interventions. I think that financial therapists do a really good job, financial coaches do a really good job at helping people arrive at these interventions because we see beyond just the numbers, right? And so it's like, okay, how do we explore what it is that you're feeling, what it is that you envision for yourself, and what it is that you are currently living, especially in the age of social media? There's so much posturing. You could be whoever you want online, but what is that doing to you when you get off Instagram, right? When you get off YouTube and you're sitting with your own thoughts and your own reality?
Yeah, I love what you're saying because when we only focus on who we want to be, sometimes it can become kind of like, I'm just going to manifest it, right? I'm going to make it happen. And we're ignoring all of the reasons, all the places that we've been before, and kind of like the things that may hold us back. And you mentioned shame, right? Sometimes we're so turned off by who we were with money that we just completely leave the conversation. And I want to, so with your trauma of money training and also all like the other trainings that you've done, the time, because you've been in the financial services world for like 15 years, right, at this point,
2011, so coming up on it, yeah.
how do you incorporate systems work into, and tell us more about like how do you work? Do you work with clients one on one? Do you mostly do education? I know you've written books, I know you have a podcast, I know you create a lot of education, but how do you work with individuals? And how, when you're working with individuals, how do you bring in system thinking?
Yeah, so I do work with individuals one on one. I've recently been winding that down from a revenue generation perspective and putting more energy and effort into a train the trainer environment. So lately I've been working with financial planners, accredited financial counselors, other financial professionals who work with people to bring these intervention methods to the forefront, or even just the general awareness that these things exist to the forefront. Because a lot of financial professionals are just looking at the numbers. They're looking at, okay, why haven't you hit your budgeting goal? Or how do I help you hit your budgeting goal? Do you have an emergency fund? How are you spending, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that there is, especially in this time, at this time, there are so many things that can discourage somebody from establishing goals, getting back on the horse if they deviate from those goals, right? We think about the global pandemic, we think about the recession, we think of just everything's expensive. Everything is hard for everybody. It's what when I work with people one on one, I tell them everything is hard for everybody. But as financial professionals, I think we also have to be conscious of how we may cause our clients to feel shame by projecting what our ideas of success look like onto the client. So because we are the professional, a lot of times we may go into those interactions saying, this is what you should be doing. This is where you should be. Why are you not doing this thing that I told you to do?
Oh my gosh, I hope financial planners are not that. That's so
It is harsh.
harsh.
It is harsh. And we see a lot.
And it's so blind because you're just blaming the
Yes.
client.
Yes. There's some big financial influencers who create content that are leveraging shame, leveraging guilt, leveraging fear. Oh, you're not where you need to be. You need to buy my masterclass. You need to buy my course. You need to buy my service. So a lot of the work that I've been doing lately has been more so speaking, whether that's workshops, just presentations, trainings, introducing financial therapy and getting into the weeds of financial trauma with this audience. But I do pro bono financial counseling for my local library, so I give back in that way. I'm not worried about chasing anybody down to pay me for one session or what have you. And so it allows for me to continue to flex this muscle of being able to show up and provide this reassurance I think that people are looking for when it comes to navigating the confusion of decision making, their own habits, what other people expect of them, what they feel like society at large expects of them, and helps them find center and being able to determine for themselves what their financial goals should be or what their financial goals are and how to move forward in that way. You asked about the trauma of money certification and some of the other trainings that I've been exposed to. Those all are perspectives, but they're not the mode, right, that I operate through, right? So I don't claim to use any one of these intervention styles as my primary style. Certainly, positive psychology, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral theory, IFS, attachment theory, the trauma of money method, like all of those things inform my approach or my approach is based off of what the interaction that I'm having with the individual is. But I think the beautiful thing of doing this healing work is that you become aware of the different healing styles that exist. And so you can hone in on what an individual needs in that particular moment, right? I have a really good friend, Stephen Hughes, shout out to Stephen, who is a financial therapist that integrates Reiki into his practice, right? And so when we think about the healing aspects of this energy manipulation in Reiki, it's almost like you might hear from a clinician's perspective, well, how do you use Reiki in financial therapy? But how do you not use Reiki in financial therapy, right? When we acknowledge that money is a form of energy. And so I think to your specific question around systems, it's important for us to be able to look at the individual parts, as I kind of talked about earlier through the IFS lens, but also look at the whole and see how one thing impacts the other. I've heard this quote from mentors and other people who are of influence: "How you do one thing is how you do everything else." And I used to fight with that so much. I'm like, no, that's not true. Just because I don't go to the gym every day doesn't mean that it's going to show up in my finances. Like, I have discipline to do this and not do that. What I found after resisting this phrasing for so long is that it's true. If we give ourselves, I don't want to say grace because I don't want to paint it in a negative light. But if we allow ourselves to have the excuse of not showing up and not being disciplined in one area of our life, then it can have a ripple effect on other areas of our life. If we decide not to exercise, we may feel more inclined to go get fast food. But we also see a positive correlation between going out and exercising every day and deciding that, you know what, I'm going to eat good food, food that nurtures my body, food that is alive, because it is aligned to the goals that I ultimately have for myself when I'm going out and I'm exercising, right? And so everything is connected.
Yeah, 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 definitely, definitely. When people are struggling with money, it makes a lot of sense given the systems that we're in, right?
100%.
Like capitalism is not really set up for people to be happy or comfortable. It's much more about exploitation. I'd love to hear what resources would you share of all the work that you've created, specifically around bringing in like the post traumatic slave syndrome that you were talking about and the financial systems? Like, where would you, if people wanted to get more informed, where would you send them?
I think so I have a newsletter on Substack called Overcoming Financial Trauma where I share really kind of like up to the minute insights directly with my audience, right? So people subscribe, I have their emails, this goes direct to their inbox. There are several layers of resistance when it comes to like my column with Forbes. Even though I have relative autonomy on how I post and when I post, I know that the audience there is a little bit more conservative. So they're probably not going to want to hear me talk about like black problems and black issues. In fact, when I look at the data from previous articles that I've written, the more general I am in what I'm talking about, the more views I have. Whereas the more specific I am in what I'm talking about to black issues, the less views that I have. And so I'm conscious of that, right? But you have to play the game. Like you talked about capitalism, right? It's I have a good friend who is like jumping off the deep end with reading content around socialism and communism, and he's like, "Hey, maybe this is not such a bad system. The way that it has been implemented in certain governments is poor, but in comparison to the exploitative nature of capitalism, he's like, socialism is looking really good, right?" I haven't jumped that far off the deep end. I do recognize the exploitative and harmful impacts of capitalism. The trauma of money reimagines capitalism in what they refer to as capitalism. I think that right now, because capitalism is the dominant economic system, that it is important for us to understand the rules of the game and to play by those rules so that we can position ourselves to do more to contribute to our families and communities. But it's hard, right? As you talk about navigating all of these different systems, we are bombarded with messaging from the time we wake up, really from before the time we wake up, every morning until the time that we go to sleep. That says you need to buy, you need to have, you need to spend in order to feel, be, look, do good things, right? And so we're on. I like to use this analogy of a conveyor belt that's pushing us in a direction that is harmful, but if we stand still, we're going to still be moving in the harmful direction. We have to make an intentional effort to move against that current or that funneling that says you need to buy the new iPhone, you need to buy the new iMac, you need to buy the new whatever, and to be intentional with how we spend and where we spend, and recognize that our dollars are it's a form of energy, right? It's energy that we're using to contribute to the machine, and however that looks, whether that be politically, whether that be in terms of economic power, whether that be in terms of education, whether that be in terms of being able to provide for our family, whether that be in terms of how we nourish our bodies. We have the power of choice in these instances, and I think that it's important to remind people of that. So I try to in the various modes. I think this is one of those modes, right? Jumping on podcasts with people. But I think most of the work that I can point to in terms of what I've created is definitely written. And so definitely I would plug up my newsletter. I plug up my column on Forbes. I've written for other outlets and publications before. And so I try to inject a little bit of this radicalism wrapped up in a way that is not threatening to what is the status quo, because I think sometimes people would jump off the deep end and they're like, oh my god, like how could you say that? Or, I mean, I've been called different names for talking about some of these social justice issues. I've been accused of being lazy. I've been accused of being a victim. I've been accused of, whatever. And I think creating a voice for people where I can acknowledge their experiences, but also offer them an alternative path is very important.
I'm thinking of some of the work that's transformed my view of money, and specifically to the racial wealth gap and to the areas of like the inequities that are in the system. I think of The Color of Money by Marissa Baradaran. She's talking about like what happened under Nixon, I think, in the 70s, and how it just continued to perpetuate the lack of access. So Marissa Baradaran is one thing. I think about Decolonized Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. I actually did an episode where like I summarized his book, and he talked about like, are you familiar with
Yes.
his work? Yeah. So his work being inside nonprofits, what you have to do in order to fit in. And I think a lot about like the privilege that I have as a person who lives in Mexico. My cost of living is a third of what it would be if I lived in the
Wow.
US, right? A third, half of what it is. And that gives me so much more flexibility. My income needs are lower. And it means that I get to spend more time doing that coaching, that lower paid one on one coaching. I get to be a little bit more, I get to push the envelope more on what I talk about, who I bring onto the podcast, and really just acknowledging again that it is a privilege because I prefer to live in Mexico than in the US.
I have a few thoughts as you share.
Yeah,
Um,
please.
First off, some other books that I would point to, books that I would use if I was going to create this body of work that provides a solution to financial trauma. Right? I think about post traumatic slave syndrome. I think about the miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson, who's the founder of Black History Week, which turned into Black History Month. I think about Powernomics by Dr. Claude Anderson. There's so many like centers of influence within the work of just the individuals that I've mentioned, but more. But as I talk about those resources, a lot of those resources speak to the plight of Black Americans specifically, right? And I think that I'm not going to call it a mistake, but one of the things that I can recognize in hindsight of what my journey has looked like over, let's call it the last 2 or 3 years, is that I got so excited about financial therapy when I found a home there that I started to abandon my original message and my original audience. I started to feel pressured to, and this is going to sound bad, but I'm going to say it and then we're going to unpack it. I started to feel pressured in creating more quote unquote inclusive content. What I find in creating more inclusive content by way of the delivery is that it dilutes the experience of the specific audience that I was looking to serve. And so then opens me up to the commentary of people who are outside of my community that would otherwise say, oh, well, that's not relevant to me, so I don't care. Or they say, oh, well, don't you, what about this person? What about that person? What about this person? I think that it's important for us to have conversations like this one where we exist in intersectional communities, whether that be from a financial planning lens, whether that be from a financial healing lens, whether that be from a cultural lens, right? But I also think that it's important for us to create resources that are specific to the communities that we come from. And that's a really tightrope to walk, right? In the age of everything being politicized. Because again, there is the whole question of, well, what about me, right? Well, why are you just talking about Black people? Or why are you just talking about poor people? Or why are you just talking about poor Black people, right? And so when I think about referencing post traumatic slave syndrome in the way that I did, well, there are a lot of Black people or people who identify as Black in America who don't have the legacy of slavery in this country. So it's not going to connect to them because the traumas that I'm speaking to are unique to the people whose ancestors were slaves here. When I talk about post traumatic slave syndrome, I think that other people of color or other minorities can relate to the impacts of colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism. And so they're saying, oh, I can see myself in that story, even though that is not my story the way that you're specifically telling it. And so I'm starting to realize that it is important, it's equally important to elevate the unique challenges of the unique audiences that I either come from or serve, while also highlighting that this is something that you might see from your vantage point and connect with based off of how your community was exploited by these very same systems. And that's where we can create unity in how we dismantle or reimagine what these systems, scratch that, how we dismantle these systems, because there's no reimagining the harmful exploitative nature of capitalism, of white supremacy, of imperialism, of colonialism. The damage has been done. What can we then do moving forward? Specifically supports our individual communities, but also allows for us to come together and unite and creating a new vision for what the future looks like. So um, as I share those resources, I'm conscious of the shift away from talking to people in the language that they understand into what is considered politically correct, or what is considered academia, or what is considered acceptable or palatable for everybody. I have recognized recently that I need to get back to the roots and saying, hey, this is the content that I'm delivering. This is the audience that I'm primarily serving. If you benefit or connect with that, great. You can participate in the conversation. But if you don't, that's okay too.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is hitting so many things inside of me, because I'm thinking, one of the things that I'm thinking is like Parker Palmer, who's Quaker. I'm Quaker. He wrote that the deeply personal is universal. So your deeply personal experience of whatever it is that you went through, there is something in most people's experience that will somewhat relate, even if it was their great grandfather, even if it was their neighbor. You know, the human experience is the human
Yes.
experience. And we all are like an individual expression of like all of our different experiences, all of our families. So whoever you're really meant to serve, the more you focus on them, the easier it'll be for people to find you. That's always what something that my mentors will tell me of, like the brighter, the clearer that it is who I'm serving, the easier it'll be for those people to find me, and to have faith that somebody else will serve the other people that aren't. Like that's kind of how I decided to do it. Again, being inclusive, serving everyone, not it was never part of my intention. And I think that might be part of someone who identifies as highly sensitive. Having a lot of people in my energy field, having a lot of people that I'm serving who want me to say something that's palatable for them, kind of fritzes
Yeah.
me out. It just like, because if I'm supposed to serve you or serve someone and they have a completely different point of view from me, the dissonance is too much for me to
Yes.
handle. And I see you
Yeah.
smiling, so
Yeah.
maybe you've also
I
connected
I mean
that, right? Because when
that's
you're,
literally what I'm sharing. I think I spent 10 years in corporate America in banking, right? In a very conservative field.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
wow.
you learn to be very diplomatic. You learn to play by the rules. You learn when not to be loud, when not to play into the stereotypes of the angry black man, or right? And that conditioning surfaces every so often, particularly because I'm still in the financial industry, right? So there's still a very conservative, very white, very know your place kind of attitude when it comes to showing up. I did a presentation for a group of financial planners. It was a Zoom. I had over 300 people in attendance. I included a survey slide on my presentation. 180 people completed the survey. One person of the 180 people that completed the survey rated the survey as not really being beneficial to them, and commented that the way that I was dressed, they described it as looking like a baseball coach, impacted the messaging somehow, some way, right? That I need to be cognizant of how I show up. And I'm like, what does that have to do with the material, right? I don't work in financial services for a financial services firm. So I don't have a uniform or dress code. How I show up is how I show up. And what I wore that day was intentional. And so to see that of 180 responses, one person decided that they wanted to hone in on how I dressed, not on the messaging or the impact of what it is that I was sharing with them, was very telling to me. And that is something that I feel like is very prevalent in the space, right? As we look to have more financial planners of color, more financial planners who are just not white, old white men, right? Women, black people, Latino people, across the spectrum of identities and cultures, because who then is being served, right? I think back to a conversation that I had in 2022 at the Financial Therapy Association's conference. A white woman who's a financial planner came up to me. We were talking about making financial therapy more accessible. And she, after we have this panel, she comes up to me and she goes, I sponsor financial planners, black financial planners, because I think that we need to have more black financial planners in the financial planning field. But for whatever reason, they're not receiving like what it is that I'm trying to do for them. I'm paraphrasing, I'm butchering it. It was several years ago. And I was like, I said, when you think about the black financial planner getting to a place where they're licensed and they're able to serve clients, who are the clients that they're serving under the dominant model for compensation? They're serving a bunch of rich white men, right? So they have to go through the hurdles to get to the point where they can have this credential to then sit there across from somebody who doesn't even identify with who they are as a person, right? How much of their, like, what are they having to deal with in that space?
When you said diplomatic, I heard code
Code
switching, I
switching,
heard
all of it.
repression, I heard
Yes.
all of the things that happen. And the financial services industry is like 70% white men. And I've dated white men. I have white men that are friends. Like there's nothing specifically against white men. It's more of just like the industry was built for
Yes.
them. So everybody that isn't that, we're left trying to figure out how to fit
Yes.
in. And there's so many people out there making changes. I love Dianco Dorsonville's 2050 Trailblazers. There's so many people creating content helping change this. And at the end of the day, when you are in the industry and you're just trying to work and like make a living, care for your family, it can wear you out.
Yes. Yes. I think it often does wear people out. And again, going to our earlier point, when we think about who is the person that I am today versus who is the person that I would like to be, right? What is the motivation for people who jump into financial services as a career path? A lot of times it's money related, right? People want to make money. And so what do I have to do in order to get to that point where, and this is the craziest thing, when I arrive to that point, if it doesn't look the way I expected it to look, or if it doesn't feel the way that I expected it to feel, what am I left with by way of my emotions, right? I did all of that work to get to here to for what? I think that's the question. For what? And I can't answer that for everybody.
You're at a point where you're kind of reevaluating, and that makes so much sense. Pendulum swings. Like we go one way really deep, and then you're like, wait, there was something else that was also interesting to me. Let me go back to that
For
portion of
me
it, right?
specifically, I'm not reevaluating because I've kind of crafted my own path, right? But I imagine, let's put it this way. I'm going into my fourth year of entrepreneurship. I left the bank in 2019, May of 2019. I'm sorry, May of 2021, and haven't looked back. I've been tempted to. I've even put in applications. But I think about a version of me that did not leave my job. And I think about the factors that contributed to me leaving my job. I didn't become a full time entrepreneur because I wanted to be a full time entrepreneur. I became a full time entrepreneur because I needed to become a full time entrepreneur. And that's a recent realization. A friend of mine asked me that question. He said, did you become an entrepreneur out of necessity or because you wanted to? I was completely content to do both, to be a full-time employee and to work on my business on the side. But when my intentions began to be questioned by my direct leadership, when I started to get bullied, when I was basically, I could see the writing on the wall that looked like either you're going to do this or you're going to do that, because we can't control the trajectory of what your success looks like as a personal brand, but we can control what the trajectory of your success looks like within this organizational structure. I said, I'm going to try my own thing. If I never left, what would my mental health look like from an anxiety perspective, from a depression perspective, from, I mean, certainly financially, I would be in a much better position than I am right now. But in terms of my happiness and my fulfillment, hands down, I made the best decision, and I would make it over and over again. And so
Yeah, because it's not just
I
about
don't
the
think
money.
that everybody has you used the word privilege earlier, has the privilege to try things, experience things. To, people don't have the privilege to sit down and think, right? I attribute the success that I've had specifically in the space of financial therapy to the ability to sit down and think. I've been able to reflect on my experiences. I've been able to reflect on other people's experiences. I've been able to reflect on the things that I've learned. I've been able to try different things. People exist in this hamster wheel like cycle where they wake up, they go to work, they come back home, they do it all over again, and they don't ever get to explore things that they're passionate about, things that they're curious about, things that they might be good at, because they have to work. And that is one of the harmful side effects of capitalism, right? We have to work to survive. And so when we talk about privilege, I'm conscious of my privilege, but I'm also conscious of the fact that I had to make a decision that could have not worked out in my favor in order to get to this place of privilege. You had to make a decision that could not have worked out in your favor in order for you to get to a place of that privilege. And I think that those of us who are risk takers, those of us who are audacious enough to take our destiny and our future in our own hands should be celebrated, because we acknowledge the systems that we navigate, and we're bold enough to step outside of that system.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. You're right. Of just, you see the cards you're handed, right? The card you're dealt. And then you got to say, I want different
Yes.
cards, or I'm going
Yes.
somewhere else. I'm going to deal them again. And I think about all the different things. Both of my parents are entrepreneurs. I don't have children. I don't have a mortgage. Like all of the things that were put in place for me to be able to make this choice. But what you said also is so beautiful. Like a lot of people don't take the time to sit down and think. And I get it, because sometimes if you sit down and evaluate your life, you may realize you're not happy with it, right?
100%.
And if you're not happy, then you're going to have to like be an adult and do
Right.
something.
Right.
So that desire to avoid evaluating our life, it makes sense. But then watch 30 years later where you look back and you're like, that's not actually who I wanted to be. The only person who's going to be responsible for it is you. And at the same time, the paradox is that we have to hold the fact that we live in systems that sometimes are just too
Yes.
exhausted. So many people just like making it through, making sure that things are kept at a certain level. There's no time left, there's no energy left to
Right.
think. So when you said in your Substack that you were going to therapy, I'm like, I want to know what happened. In your work as a financial expert, and the fact that you're moving so much into financial therapy, for people that may be listening, were there any telltale signs that said, you know what, I need outside help in a therapeutic sense? What kind of ways would you invite people to evaluate themselves in order to see if it's time to either hire a financial therapist or hire a regular therapist, or whatever it is, whatever it looks like for them to
Yeah.
seek help?
Great question. I kind of summarized the background, but I maybe didn't go as deep as I'm going to go now, right? Um, like I said, I've been an entrepreneur going on 4 years now. And I got to a point recently where I was like, I should be further along financially in terms of being able to anticipate my income than I am. And so and I started thinking about what I want. Like it's the same thing that we've been talking about, right? The version of me that is existing now versus the version of me that I would like to see. And the version of me, this is gonna sound so funny. The version of me that I would like to see is this version of me that lives in an apartment that is a luxury apartment that has a gym, that has a front desk person that I could go down and they can say, "Hey, good morning, Rahkim," and I'm talking to them, and I'm getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm going for a jog with my dog, and that's not the reality that I live in. But on the other side of that, I was experiencing some deep guilt for not being happy with what it is that I have. I own my home, a beautiful two-family home with a small yard and a garage, two-car garage, and like I can plant in my. I don't have to ask permission for anything. And I went from living in my mom's apartment to owning a home. Like I never went through what it was like to have an apartment, what it was like to have a roommate, like just from being a kid to being an adult overnight. And I recognize that there are people who want what I have. There are people who like, what, you're complaining about the fact that you don't have a job and you own your home and you could do what you want. You own your day, and I really do. I own my day. But at the time, I went to my mom's house and I was telling her about just how I was feeling. I said, Mom, I'm experiencing a couple of things. I feel lonely because I live alone. Like I'm single. I'm a single man with no kids and a dog. So I'm lonely. I don't want to live in a house. I want to live in an apartment. And I'm not making enough money. And I'm just really frustrated. And my mom goes, maybe you need to talk to somebody. And I just kind of brushed it off because I was like, this is just a moment. Like this is a transition point. I'll get over it. And I think that I conveyed that to her with the look that I gave her in response. And my mom knows me because I come from her, right? She goes, if you have a problem with going to therapy, it would be very hypocritical of you to call yourself a financial therapist. And I was like, no, I don't have a problem with going to therapy. I just never viewed therapy as a solution. Because to me, therapy in the mental health capacity was for if I was experiencing a mental health emergency. I was viewing therapy the way that I would view urgent care or going to the emergency room, right? I wasn't viewing therapy through the lens of this is regular maintenance, like going to get my physical every year. And I think that that is a cultural thing with men in this country, and specifically with Black men in this country, because I see the same parallel when it comes to healthcare. There are a lot of men, Black men specifically, who do not go and get annual screenings. They only go to the doctor when something hurts, when something's wrong, when they want to figure it out. And so after I talked to her about it, I talked to a friend of mine who is a Black man as well. And he was like, yeah, like, I love my therapist. I can't wait to talk to my therapist. It's when we are navigating life changes and these turning points in our lives that therapists like really shine through. You should definitely go see one. And so I have a subscription to LinkedIn Premium. And when I paid for my first month, they gave me like a month of membership to BetterHelp. And so I said, well, I'm just going to take advantage of this because it's already paid for. It's a resource. Inputted all the intake data. I requested a Black male therapist, and the person that responded to me was a white male therapist. And he says, I'm not a Black male therapist, but I've worked with Black men. I think that I can help you if you give me a shot. So I was like, oh, whatever. Like I'll give it a shot, right? Had my first session, and I was like, okay. Like I had my first session. I don't have the warm and fuzzies about it, but I did it, right? It was something to check off. I scheduled a second session. I had the second session, and I had even less warm and fuzzies about it. So this is what I've learned. I was not unhappy. I was frustrated. And the reaction to working with that therapist was, or rather his reaction to hearing my story was, I don't know if this was his intention, but this is how I internalized it, was coddling. It was like he was giving me permission to not do anything new. He was like, you have done in your 34 years more than some people will ever do. You have done things that some people will never do. do you take time to celebrate your successes? And I'm like, not really. I do the thing and then I move on to the next thing, right? And he was like, you are very results driven. And as an entrepreneur, what I've noticed with other entrepreneurs is they learn to appreciate the journey. So maybe you need to learn to appreciate the journey. And so it wasn't a complete bust, right? But in the going back and forth between us, there were just things that he was missing. He had focused on or had come to the determination that I had low self esteem, and was asking questions about my relationship with my parents and like viewing that from an estranged perspective. And I'm like, no, like you're completely off, like you're wrong. But I consider myself to be very self aware. And so, in kind of like arguing with the therapist, I recognized that's not the problem, but this is the problem. So, I was doing a little bit of like introspective work that was kind of like in defense of the way that he was presenting his observations to me. He wanted to use CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, as his intervention method. He introduced me to some cognitive distortions. He asked me like, what do I relate to? And I remember the feeling. I described this to my sister actually afterwards. I said, I feel like this guy wants to come into my head and rearrange my furniture. And he goes, and my sister goes, well, isn't that their job? And I'm like, yeah, but like, I'm not looking for him to make me okay with what it is that I've accomplished. I'm looking for him to help me find the tools to navigate the frustration of what I'm going through. And I feel like that was a miss because there was some cultural differences, right? He was a white man, an older white man, and I'm a younger black guy. And I feel like he didn't understand this drive that we internalize to do more, to be better, to show up, like why we feel like we have to do twice as much to get just as far. I think that he can understand from an academic perspective, but not an intuitive one. And that's why I was like, I really want to focus on somebody who has that cultural relevance to me because, like I said, I just felt like he was coddling me. So I gave him 2 shots and I was like, yeah, it's not going to work. And this week I fired him and I got matched with another therapist. So I do have my third therapy session actually happening tomorrow, but this time it's going to be with a black woman.
Yeah. And thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing, especially the fact about like, oh, in general, men don't ask for help until something's really broken, right? And that's what we like. That's part of patriarchy. Patriarchy hurts everyone. It's not just about misogyny. It's also just like everyone's put down by it. And I've had experiences with therapists. I had a Latina therapist when I was in college, and she focused so much on the Latina experience that I was actually turned off by it. But in college, this happens often with immigrants, is that you're rejecting the community that you're coming from in order to fit in. So I think that's a little bit of what happened then. And then I've had white therapists. Like I've been in therapy for a long time. And the therapist that I'm working with right now, she's from Chile. And the beauty of being able to talk to her about like things that happen in my family in Spanish and being able to switch over to English when I need to. If it's work, it's English. If it's family, it's Spanish, is so helpful.
I can imagine.
It's so, so helpful. So good luck with like finding someone that it feels like a good cultural shift. I've also worked with coaches, like business coaches. I think I worked for the life coach for like 3 sessions just to like test it out right before. I just want to see what else is out there. What's it all about? And coaching has a very different focus. So maybe that could be something different. But I mean, coaches are very future-oriented. Therapists are kind of looking at your furniture. They are trying to be like, what's underneath this furniture? Any cobwebs? And if that's not what you're into right now, that's fine.
I think I have a lot of thoughts, but I appreciate you sharing that with me because I think that those things matter. Like my sister told me as well. She's been in therapy for a little while. And she was like, I had a black woman therapist and it was not a match. But now she has a Latina therapist and she's like, she's phenomenal. And so I do recognize that sometimes those differences do solve for what, like, if we're in our own way culturally, then the therapist is not really going to help. But I think that I was looking for empathy that he could not extend to me. And this is going to sound terrible, but this is my perception of the situation, because he did not have very high expectations for me. Right. So if I'm coming in with all that I've accomplished, he's looking at it as, well, damn, like, you did all of these things. You should be proud of yourself. Versus, cool, what do you want to do next? Right. I feel like his biases may have surfaced in that. Even some of his entitlement may have surfaced in that. He wanted to solve a problem for me by, actually, I wrote this down in my notes, sterilizing my ambition. That's like what I took away from the session. And maybe that's not true, but that's how I felt about it. And I think, that's valid, right? That matters. But yeah, I just, even like when I thought more and more about it, I started to get more and more frustrated, because if I specified in my request for a therapist that I'm looking for a black male therapist, and a white male therapist comes in and says, hey, I'm not a black male therapist, but I think that I can help you, I feel like there's a level of entitlement there that I wasn't looking for you. So you're injecting yourself into this experience, into what it is that I'm seeking out. And yes, your intentions may be positive, but I feel like sometimes this is the case of white professionals who, they're very liberal. Like, they want to help out, they want to contribute. I don't want to psychoanalyze anybody, but there could be a guilt there. There could be a recognition of their privilege there, but they operate through this lens of like the savior complex that says, I need to be the one to save you, and if you don't let me save you, well, boo hoo, I'm sad because you're not letting me save you the way that I want to save you. In those instances, they fail to realize is that it's not about them. It's about me. It's about the person you're trying to save. And so if we are not willing to accept what it is that you're trying to offer by way of quote unquote saving us, then that's okay. Because sometimes your presence is a trigger. Sometimes your presence is more of a trigger than it is, providing salvation. And sometimes they get offended by that. I don't think that he did. He offered on multiple occasions to rematch me with a black therapist, and ultimately that's where we ended up. But I look at, what was the intention there? If I'm specifically requesting a black therapist and you surface and say, hey, I can take on this situation.
Well, what was it in you that said, okay, let me try this person who wasn't what you wanted, right? So it's always, we can never really know what was in the other person's
That's true.
head.
That's true.
But finding the right fit with a therapist it's a gift when it happens.
That's what I've heard.
The one that I'm with right now, I've been in therapy before, but it's never felt as transformative as it does with this person. And I don't know that. I think it's honestly because she's older, she's experienced more than the fact that she's Latina. But I'm super supportive of you continuing to look for it. And I want to share with you a quote that's from a black male therapist, Resma Menachem. I don't know if you've heard of his work. He wrote, My Grandmother's Hands. So he does somatic abolitionism, getting racism out of our body. And the quote he wrote, like, let your pain come up, not so that you can heal it. Like, whatever the frustration, whatever the anger, the loneliness, let it come up, not so that you can heal it, but so you can hold it. You can just have it in your body, and it can cook you. So that the holding the pain itself is what transforms you. And you don't even hold it in order to be transformed, but you hold it because it's true and it's real. Right? So his work, the way that I've learned about therapeutic things for finances is actually through like somatic abolitionism, his work, compassionate inquiry that's much more focused on addiction, and trying out different therapists, trying out different coaches, seeing what's out there. So I really want to congratulate you on like going into the next part of that inner awareness and like knowing, yeah, I have a lot of tools, but let me see what else is out there. Because I think that learning, that desire to learn is what helps us as professionals, but it's also what I see in my clients. Like the clients that I serve are people who are like, you know what, this isn't working. Let me try something new.
I love that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rahkim, for your time. Thank you so much for opening and like talking about your entire corporate experience, to the training you've gotten, the work that you've done, the pro bono work, your own therapy, the therapy place where you are right now in your therapy journey. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to continuing to learn from
Yes,
you.
I have to say before I let you go, I am inspired and encouraged by your work. Super grateful for you sharing your platform with me and bringing me on. It was absolutely a pleasure to go into the different aspects and avenues of what my experience is and learning about your experience. So I thank you for holding this space for me. And I look forward to us staying in contact and working together in the future.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Highly Sensitive Money. It was a pleasure to explore the connections between financial trauma, empowerment, and healing. I hope today's conversation with Rahkim offered you a new way to look at your relationship with money. If you'd like to dive deeper into your own personal financial patterns or explore my work, head over to my website, oddthecolors.net. There, you'll find resources and tools that can support you on your financial journey, including a quiz on money archetypes that can reveal your unique approach to money. It's a fun way to start understanding your personal money dynamics and make shifts towards your goals. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd be so grateful if you could rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your support helps others find highly sensitive money and brings more voices into our community. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode where we'll continue exploring ways to manage money with mindfulness and sensitivity. Thanks for listening and see you next time.